1,000-year reign of Christ. And so that's where our story then will start here. Now, that verse goes on to say he, that's Jesus the Messiah. That's a third-person singular. Up till then, it said your offspring will be in antagonism to Satan. Then the sentence changes here to a singular. He will crush your head. That's a fatal blow to Satan. If you get your head run over by a truck, obviously that's fatal. And you will strike his heel. That's a non-permanent blow. If you have your foot run over by a truck, you probably will survive just fine with a bit of repair work. And so that's a non-permanent blow to Christ. That shouldn't be showing up like that. That resulted in his death, burial, and resurrection by the end of the week that began on Sunday in Israel. And of course, that's the striking of his heel. I'm sure Satan thought, I've won the victory. The Son of God is dead. He's been buried. But of course, we know that a week later he was resurrected. Now, there were a number of things in the scripture, especially in the Gospel of John, which we're going to be looking at. We looked at a lot last year, but just looking at a few ancillary things here. There were a number of events that led up to Jesus' last week. And I just want to review some of those. Jesus proved his being Messiah through miracles which God allowed him to perform. Now, people sometimes get the feeling that miracles happen throughout the Bible, but direct miracles, they go against nature, the healing of impossible instances of disease and so on. Those don't happen throughout the Bible. There are a couple of instances of miracles in the Old Testament, certainly around the time of Moses and around the time of Elijah and Elisha. But it isn't something that went on all the time. What Jesus did was truly unique. And so we read in John 7:31, many of the people believed in him, and they said, well, when the Christ, the Messiah, comes, he will do more signs than this man has done? We don't think so. This man is doing everything that would prove he's the Messiah. But throughout the history of Christ's earthly ministry, there was always an antagonism, an underlying antagonism toward him. And that was primarily political opposition. And politics has been the same throughout the whole history of mankind. Politics is dirty. Politics is mean. You will do anything you can to discredit your opponent. Now, we see that going on all the time today, and the Pharisees did the same thing. Remember that the Pharisees were the leading political party of their day. That before them had been the Sadducees. They were the leading political party. During the time of Christ, it was the Pharisees. They pretty much controlled the people. They controlled them through the Jewish law. And so that if someone got out of line, the Pharisees would be all over them, making sure that they had full control over the whole population. So the Pharisees said, this man's not from God. They didn't deny his miracles. They just said he's not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. Now, we could spend a lot of time in Sabbath keeping and what that means and so on. We're going to spend a little time this summer, Lord willing, because my desire through the summer is to cover the book of Romans. And Paul talks a great deal about salvation by works versus faith and so on in that book. But the Pharisees say, he doesn't keep the Sabbath. I don't care if he's raising people from the dead, which he did. He's bad because he doesn't keep our rules. But then others said, well, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Remember, in the Gospel of John, signs is the word for miracles. The word miracle never appears in the Gospel of John. John uses the synonym of signs. How can a man who's a sinner do such things? So there was division among them. And the them there is the people who said, how could you do more? Versus the Pharisees that said he's just a sinner. And of course, they would then say he's under the power of Satan, and so on. And so throughout the life of Christ, then, there was always an undertow of antagonism to him. Now, that undertow became much more overt after the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And after that unique miracle, and everyone knew it happened because there were people standing around when Jesus called Lazarus out of the grave and so on. There was no denying that Jesus had raised someone from the dead. So now the enthusiasm of the people was beginning to reach a crescendo. And so under that crescendo then, the Pharisees had to do something. They had to stop this guy. Why? Because we'll lose our political position. Political positions are power. And you need power if you're going to maintain the situation that the Pharisees had over the people. They had complete control. So the Jewish leaders, though, didn't deny that Jesus was the Messiah. They never said he's not the Messiah. They just said he's a sinful guy. He can't be. But he never actually came out and said he wasn't. So the chief priests and the Pharisees, now the priests were the religious leaders. Pharisees pretended to be religious, but they were anything but. And the Pharisees then, they gathered the council, that's the Jewish Sanhedrin of 70 men. Rome allowed every nation it conquered to have their own government as long as they obeyed Roman laws. And that was the council that the Jews were allowed. They got together in the council and said, what are we going to do? This man performs many signs. He's doing miracles. They're not denying that. You become, in a political situation like this, blinded to truth. You can't see truth when it happens because your political position is so strong. That doesn't sound familiar at all, does it? Things just don't change. The antagonism between political parties is so real today, but it was no different in these days, and it was just as strong. So the political reaction of the Jewish leadership then, they had to do something. They were beginning to reach panic mode, and so they made plans to put him to death. We can't just discredit him. We can't just say he's from Satan. We got to kill him. This guy has to go. Now, that raising of Lazarus took place in the town called Bethany. And Bethany sits on the eastern side of the Mount of Olives, which is here, and is just a relatively short walk from the city of Jerusalem. And so this then brought many people into the area of Jerusalem. And so in John 12:9, when the large crowd of the Jews learned Jesus was there, they came not only on account of him, but they wanted to see Lazarus. They were curious to see this guy who had died. And excuse me, lots of people had seen the miracle of raising Lazarus. They were there because they were mourning his death and had spent time with the family, Mary and Martha and so on. And so they came not just because of Christ, but to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So lots of people had gathered for this very momentous miracle, not just for the fact that this was the Jewish Passover week. That brought lots of people, but a lot of people were really curious. And so the people present when Lazarus was raised continued through this time to witness to the event. And we read the crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to bear witness. So it was a continuing discussion. And the reason why the crowd went to meet him was that they had heard that he had done this sign. So they heard that Jesus was there, and they wanted to meet him. They wanted to see him because he was in the area, so they would have gathered around him. Now in verse 10 of chapter 12, we read that already the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well. We got to kill him. Because if people see him walking around and they know he was dead and he got buried, and he's still walking around, how are we going to deny the reality of the miracle? So we got to figure out a way. We got to hire a hitman for him. We got to put him back in the grave. Because on account of him, Lazarus, many of the Jews were going away from the Jewish leadership and saying, you guys aren't who you say you are. And they were believing in Jesus. And so this became panic time for the Jewish politics. Well, those in Jerusalem then for the Passover heard that Jesus was coming. So the next day then, after this event took place, the raising of Lazarus, the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming into Jerusalem. I showed you Bethany a little distance over the Mount of Olives, and he could have walked easily from Bethlehem, or from Bethany rather, into the city. And so they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him. This would have been the way they would have greeted a royal person, a person of importance coming into the city through the city gate. So they took branches of palm trees, went out to meet him, and crying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. Now that word Hosanna is a transliteration from Greek to English, which means, please save us, if you will. They were quoting from Psalm 118:25 that says, save us, we pray, O Lord, we pray, give us success. And that's a related word, sosan, meaning to save or deliver us. So they were saying, save us. Now, we'll see in just a second, Jesus' idea of saving them and their idea of saving them may be very different. But originally, this was an Aramaic word, and it evolved into a shout of praise, sort of a hallelujah type praise. Now then they also said, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's Psalm 118:26, where the psalmist had written about a future event where a king would come. And they repeated that as well. And then they said, even the King of Israel. Now, this wasn't the first time that the people thought about Jesus being king. This, as we'll see in a second, had happened before. The problem is they wanted, of course, political freedom from Rome. They didn't like Rome's control over their country and so on. And so they needed a king then to help them. Excuse me just a second. Coming back at this time of year when it's cold out never works. I don't like it. But anyway, we decided how to fix that. Next year we'll come back in April. Anyway, this was not the first time that people thought about Jesus being king. For instance, back in John chapter 6, there was a crowd in Galilee. They had wanted to make Jesus king after he fed the 5,000 men plus their wives and children. And there was great excitement about who he was. And Jesus, perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, why did he do that? Because he knew what their real thinking was. He knew they were not recognizing him as Messiah, nor was he being recognized as Messiah when he came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Maybe some saw him that way, but definitely not all. Now, the problem is they didn't recognize him as Messiah. They had a free meal, and they liked that feeding the 5,000. So Jesus, and it was probably pretty good. They had fish and they had bread, and, a nice picnic meal for all this huge crowd of people. So Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, which it was a miracle, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. But Jesus still used that opportunity to preach to them about faith. Faith in himself, faith in Jehovah, and so on. So he explained to them, I am, he said, the bread of life. If I come into your life, it will make a difference. It will be something that will change your life. Well, after this then, after he preached for a while, in fact, there were 40 verses there. After this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. One day they wanted him to be king. The next day he didn't feed them, so they turned away. And so there's this bouncing back and forth. Oh, we want him to be king. He didn't give us anything else to eat. Why bother? And so then, on that Palm Sunday, that after the time of the raising of Lazarus, and Jesus is coming into the city, and they're all gathering around with their palm leaves, and they're singing Psalm 118. In John 12:14, we read, Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. As it is written in Old Testament prophecy, fear not, daughter of Zion. Zion is Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. So Jesus allowed these events to happen. He had the disciples prepared. He had told them to go to a certain place. They'll find this young donkey, and he would get on that and be carried into the city. It wasn't like a major royal coming with chariots. I mean, they had chariots and so on. He wasn't standing in a chariot waving to the crowd with a crown on his head or anything like that, but he was sitting very humbly on a donkey's colt. Well, this is part of a prophecy from the book of Zechariah, next to the last book of the Old Testament. Zechariah said, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, or Jerusalem. Sing aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so that here he comes on this young donkey. People are cheering and waving their palm fronds and so on. And the Hosanna that they were screaming and celebrating, which means save us, had meaning that Jesus understood, but the people would not have conceived of. They wanted to be saved from Rome. They wanted a king who would defeat Rome and chase him out. They would make the mistake approximately 30 years later of trying to chase Rome out, and that was the end of Israel. But at this point, they thought a king could do that. And so the people wanted salvation from the Roman Empire. Jesus knew he was to die for mankind's eternal salvation 5 days later. And so, excuse me, the two of them weren't thinking the same things. So Jesus entered Jerusalem. He knew that 5 days later he would be taken back outside the city and crucified. And so the being taken and killed, he fully anticipated that was going to be the end of the week. At the second coming, though, Jesus will come as king, and we realize that's still yet future. We've still got the rapture of the church, the great tribulation, the second coming of Christ to form his 1,000-year reign, and so on. Jesus knew, although this was a valid offer to Israel, it was valid what he was offering, that he could have been their king and their Messiah. He could have delivered them from Rome. But he also knew the people weren't going to be able to handle this at this point, and the antagonism would arise. Matthew added another description of this same event, which has a little bit of telling in it. When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, who is this? And the crowd said, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. They didn't say, this is the Messiah. The city was not celebrating the coming of the Messiah. Some might have been, and there were probably some greeting him as he came into the city who had that in mind. But in general, the crowd saw him as a prophet. They knew he performed miracles. They knew he taught very deep spiritual things, so they called him a prophet. Well, in verse 16 of chapter 12, even his disciples did not understand what was going on here. At first, of course, they didn't understand. They would, as we'll see later. But when Jesus was glorified, that is, he was raised from the dead, ascended to his Father, and so on, then they remembered that these things had been written about him and had been done to him. So they didn't understand at the time any more than anyone else did, I guess, maybe a little more. But eventually they would fully understand what was impossible at this point. To them to fully understand, several things had to happen. First of all, Jesus had to be arrested, crucified, and buried. Then he had to be resurrected the next Sunday, and then the church age had to be initiated. And so we see then that there were many events that would cause the disciples to fully grasp what had happened on this very special day. Up till then, they were a little confused themselves. If he was going to enter as king, the disciples were probably thinking, then become king. Take over. You're the Son of God. You can do this. So that they would have been confused, and understandably so. So in verse 19 of John chapter 12, the Pharisees are still very frustrated. The Pharisees said to one another, you see, you guys are gaining nothing. We're getting nowhere. The council is failing here. The world has gone after him. They're all excited. They're talking about him. Everybody out that are supposed to be celebrating the Passover is talking about this Jesus. Mark said something else about that. In Mark 14, it was 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, so that would have been about Wednesday of the week. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. They had to somehow figure out some way to arrest him where nobody could see them. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. These people are too excited. We can't just go up and have a bunch of policemen pick them up and take them to jail. There would be great unrest among the people. So they were still in this quandary. They didn't know what to do. He was performing miracles. He was taking over their political position, if you will. They didn't like it, but they were kind of having difficulty figuring out what to do about it. So there was too much enthusiasm among the crowds. But those same crowds maybe would turn against Jesus and make the leadership's job easy, because it was only then 5 days after this particular Sunday that the crowd stood and yelled at Pilate, crucify him. And so we don't know how many were those same people. Remember, we saw before, we want him to be king. He fed us. He hasn't fed us. We don't want him as king. And so this was going to change quickly. Israel was not ready for their Messiah. Even though it was a valid offer, and God knew they wouldn't be ready, but it was his time to come and die for man's sin, that these events took place. These events are really about his death, burial, and resurrection. So in verse 20, now among those who went up to worship at the feast were also some Greeks. Greeks are Gentiles as opposed to Jews. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Now it seems like a small event, not too important, but it was a signal to Jesus. We know there are Gentiles converting to Judaism all through the book of Acts. And these were considered devout converts to Judaism. And so we know that those kinds of Gentiles were present among the Jewish people who had gathered. Why Philip? Well, Philip was a Greek name, not a Jewish name. So he had a Gentile name. They felt comfortable with him. He was from Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee, and that had already been converted into a Gentile city. And so he was from sort of a Gentile city. They said, let's talk to Philip. He's not as Jewish as these other guys. So in verse 22, Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. And Jesus answered, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. That's the signal that things were about to change dramatically. He knew the right time for his death and to bring the message of salvation out of Israel and into the entire world, because Gentile people would become part of the church. The Gentile world was ready to hear the message of salvation, and Jesus saw that in the curiosity of these Gentiles. Now, that in the church age to follow, let's face it, it'd be primarily Gentile people. I think most of us in this room are probably Gentile. Some of us have maybe some Jewish blood, and we know there are saved Jewish people today. Phyllis Gordon is certainly one of those. but it was primarily made up of Gentiles. Jesus recognized that. So he said, now is my soul troubled. But what shall I say? He said, I don't want to be associated with the sins of man. So he said, Father, should I say, save me from this hour? And he said, no, that's why I came. That's the purpose. I have come to this hour to meet death for sin. So the sinless Son of God would have all of mankind's sins placed upon him. And so in verse 28, he goes on to say, Father, glorify your name. Then a voice from heaven, I've glorified it, and I will glorify it again. Now, the people didn't understand that. They heard a noise that sounded like thunder, and Jesus said, this voice has come for your sake, not mine. He said, I knew that this was going to happen, that I would glorify God through my death, burial, and resurrection. It didn't have to come to Jesus, but there needed to be a sign to the people. So he said, judgment of this world is here. Nor will the ruler of this, now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. That, of course, is Satan, fulfilling Genesis 3:15. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And so we read then, further in the New Testament, he has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transformed us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. Today, we are that kingdom. We are a spiritual kingdom, not the kingdom that he one day will establish for 1,000 years, but a spiritual kingdom here on earth, as he's seated at the right hand of God the Father, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Well, that's what we have time for this morning, and my goal was to see that all of these events that take place during the life of Jesus always has some background and something going on underneath among the Jewish leadership. Now, there will be no Sunday school next week. By the way, one day that great dragon Satan will be thrown down out of heaven, and we see that in the book of Revelation. So that this is the striking of the heel of the son of the woman being completed during this week, especially on Friday, as he is crucified, buried, and on Sunday raised again. So there'll be no class next week for Sunday school, because that's Easter Sunday, and so I'll see you again next Sunday, and I thought I would use one of my great-grandchildren to remind you that my great-grandpa will be back in 2 weeks. See ya in 2 weeks.